Hello, everyone. I'm Mystery.
And I am Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we are the Duality of Man.
Today, we're going to talk about the duality of man and government and about how our government has failed its citizens, but also how we really have also failed our responsibilities to our government as well.
And how governments historically have also been regularly failing their men because as per the title, this is a men's rights and men's issues show primarily. And this whole patriarchy thing of feminist imagining. Um, the receipts tell a vastly different story when you actually look into it.
You want to start off with the draft?
I think that's as good a place to start as any because the biggest lie in modern day even anti-feminism, because I see a lot of anti-feminists parroting this line of the first and second waves didn't do nothing, but the third wave went completely batshit doolally. And again, while that's a nice line in theory, a nice point of attack in theory, it is not so. For you see, female suffrage as given by as supported by the suffragettes is unique among suffrage in any other demographic throughout history because going all the way back to societies like Greece and ancient Greece and Rome, the uh the ability to have civil say in your government, the ability to vote and voice your democratic will insofar as that's ever been a thing, has always been contingent on the draft and landowning, but that's sort of neither here nor there. But yeah, always the draft or landowning. Whereas when women were given the vote, um, again backed largely by the suffragette movement, they were given the vote completely gratis, sans draftable responsibilities. And this, to me, strikes me as one of the most glaring men's issues that just never gets talked about because in my head, this is kind of a Faustian bargain. To some people more, traditional and conservative than myself, they would probably even make the argument that um, the obligation for the draft isn't enough to justify the vote. And I'm looking at that and going, so you're telling me that in order to have any say about the place in which I live and the place in which I'm expected to function and make a life for myself, I have to literally sell my life to the war machine. And maybe in ages past, you could make the argument that that wasn't so bad. Never mind that there weren't, medical standards for most of human history on the battlefield, and therefore often getting medical treatment on the battlefield was almost worse than just leaving it untreated. Um, but certainly in a post mechanized warfare civilization, as per the first couple world wars, that to me strike is almost to the letter, literally selling your soul to get the vote. And if it were universal, you could at least make the argument that we're being egalitarian about it. It's still a humanitarian travesty, in my opinion, but at least then we would be being egalitarian about it. Everyone would be under the same yoke. But not so historically, because again, men, every class and category of men that was ever given the vote was also signed up inherently for the concept of the draft. Women got it for
Yeah.
nothing. And
It was kind of like it's saying that, all right, if you want to decide how the society is going to be run, then you have to be
you have to
willing
risk
to
something
fight to
in it.
defend it.
Yeah. And I would argue that that's not exactly an equally weighted bargain because I don't think given how easily a vote can be canceled out or made mathematically irrelevant, I would say that it is still a heavily weighted bargain. But interestingly enough, when female suffrage was an issue in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, many women opposed the idea of suffrage as proposed by the suffragettes because they assumed that, like every other demographic on the face of the historical record, it would come with an obligation for the draft, and many women didn't want to get the draft. Also worth noting, those very same anti-suffragette women thought that it would be unfair to their menfolk, because the thing of it was, while men de jure had, landowning men de jure had the right to vote, they were expected to use that right to vote on the behalf of their entire families and or households. Which, again, I think I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about um, the idea of the woman holding covert or informal power despite not having any de jure formal power, which is, you cannot tell me that the phenomena of the yes dear syndrome or the you're sleeping on the couch syndrome is a modern invention.
No,
It's
I mean,
no,
you
in
could.
no meaningful way a modern invention. So
I mean, we know that it's existed for like probably centuries. I mean, look at Shakespeare's famous play Macbeth.
yeah,
I mean, he
there
was basically pushed into doing a lot of terrible things by his wife.
yeah, there are medieval examples, there are ancient Greco-Roman examples, there are legends up and down the centuries. It's referenced in religious texts up and down the centuries. Again, when men were the ones who de jure had the right to vote because they were expected to do it for their entire family, and because we all know about the yes year syndrome or the you're sleeping on the couch syndrome, um, especially in a time before electricity where women were expected to basically be the utilities of a given household or homestead. um, you can't tell me that the conversation never went down like, so honey, you're going to vote for this person, yes, or you're not going to eat tomorrow. And then he said yes, dear. If you seriously want to make the case to me that that never happened, the burden is very much on you, because I think anyone who knows anything about human nature or history or even just human psychology knows, in such a situation where men have a formal power, those in informal power over him, usually women and children, had at least some say in it. So many anti suffragette women, knowing this, they referred to it as the power of necessity. They said, we have the power of necessity over our households and homesteads and our husbands. So to give us any more power on paper than that would be unfair to our husbands. And frankly, I I find myself nostalgic for the anti-suffragette women at this point, because it's like, where did that rationale go? The idea of we are obligated to use the power we have fairly towards our husbands because it would be unfair otherwise. Where did all the women who understood Stan Lee's razor go? With great power comes great responsibility.
That implies they ever existed.
Well, again, we know they existed because there were anti-suffragette women who made these arguments.
Well, was it because that may have been the argument that they made, but do you think that the most underlying thing that drove them was, I don't want to go to war?
Well, okay, but that's not an unreasonable position, really. Because again, it's kind of a Faustian bargain when you get right down to it. It's literally sell your soul to the government and the state, or you don't get any say in what that state does to you or at you.
But let's not forget, Dalton, that there are a lot of women that, you know, if someone they knew didn't get drafted but didn't volunteer, they would they would shame
They
them.
would shame them. Yes, there are also what I guess we could call the traditional gynocentric women. I'm just saying that you know much in the same way as some of the greatest men's rights advocates in this day and age are the honey badgers. Your Allison Tiemans, Karen Straughns, and Hannah Waltons. Praise be unto the honey badgers, by the way. Um, but just like that, I don't think women with the capacity to understand the power of necessity, especially considering that that's what they called it, are a new phenomenon either. Just in the same way as we all know that the yes gear syndrome and the you're sleeping on the couch syndrome isn't a modern invention. We also know that women who actually have some sense of self-awareness and responsibility are not a new phenomenon either. My question is why the fuck didn't we listen to those women instead of the women who were like, we want everything, but we want it for nothing. We want all of the fripperies and the shiny things, but with none of the obligations or contractual arrangements thereof.
But to speak about the government, like the government has the responsibility to be miserly with the lives of its soldiers. They have the responsibility to not throw away their lives pointlessly. And as I'm sure you're aware, governments around the world throughout history have engaged in some absolutely pointless wars.
Beyond pointless sometimes. It's gone right through the plane of pointless entirely and gone straight into the actively counterproductive space. They're in the upside down of moral philosophy. They've gone right through this is not helping and right into the this is actively counterproductive
Yeah, all
in
those
many
lives
cases.
wasted for the sake of power, greed, you know,
Ideology, culture, religion, etc.
ego.
Yeah. The we are the aristocracy, so we get to declare, and the peasants will just carry out our will. Again, and I don't mean to simp for those in history again, but for the second time in as many minutes, I'm thinking to myself, at least the old aristocracy had the notion of meritocracy and noblesse oblige in the sense of if I am to rule over these people, I have to be expected to obtain a higher standard of conduct, elocution, education, etc. Whereas now, the modern day aristocracy actively resents the very concept of meritocracy or noblesse oblige in any meaningful way. They again, it's a case of they want all of the pomp and circumstance, none of the reciprocity or contractual obligations thereof.
You know, it's not just during war that soldiers' lives get thrown away. It's also after they come home. I want to talk about specifically the opioid crisis and how the VA is responsible for really kicking it off. Do you know that they were actually paid off? The Veterans Affairs Office was paid off by a company called Purdue Pharma, who makes OxyContin. It gave the VA pain management team $200,000. That's what our soldiers' lives were worth to that team. $200,000.
Uh-huh. And while we're talking about things that happen to soldiers after they get home, um, let's not forget the in-between war times phenomena of the your kind isn't allowed in here. I.e., when a war is actually going on, we tend to idealize soldiers because they're defending us. But the very second we're in peace times and enough time goes by that people are allowed to feel comfortable, they suddenly have nothing but contempt for those baser men that do all that fighting and whatnot.
Yes. They're forced to do terrible things for the sake of others, and then the people that they did that for just wring their hands of them and don't want to be bothered. That's absolutely despicable.
And while we're talking about humanitarian issues with warfare, largely aided and abetted by governments. Are we going to talk about the obvious mental health issues of post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock, and nostalgia, as it used to be called? Because again, not a not PTSD is not a modern phenomenon or even a phenomena caused by the mechanization of war. There's been some understanding of people coming back psychologically damaged and changed from war again since at
I
least the
mean, I
time
can
that
I can
Homer
absolutely
was
imagine
writing the
that.
Odyssey and the Iliad.
I mean, think about it. In those situations, you're face to face with the people that you are finding and killing. Like you're literally looking into somebody's eyes as his life is fading away because you like stabbed him with a sword or something.
Because there was actual close quarters hand to hand combat of some description usually. Although I will say, of the two ways of doing war, I favor the old school battle lines and then close quarter fighting method to the guerrilla warfare and um, death by machine that we have in the modern era. Because at least those soldiers had to have some respect for their fellow combatants, and they had to take responsibility for the thing they were doing. Whereas now, it's you're you're expected to dehumanize your enemy, and then the ways you're allowed to kill them do nothing but further your ability to disassociate, which probably I know we just talked about how PTSD is not a new phenomenon, but I will say it's probably getting worse because of the sheer scale of it, and the level of depravity seems to be getting worse and worse as we go more and more hard into guerrilla style warfare instead of some degree of strategic or like battle line or organized warfare.
Yeah. But to get back to the VA, I'm reading this article from Newsweek, says that the team lied about the opiates' addictive effects, saying that opiates rarely cause addiction.
Um, I that 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 just requires a moment of silence so that stupidity sink in. That's all that needs.
Yes, apparently 60% of veterans who fought in the Middle East and 50% of older veterans have chronic pain, and they just pumped them full of opiates. And then when they realized what they were doing and tried to cut them off, well, the pain is still there. And now they have this addiction to deal with as well. And you're not really giving them anything to help deal with the first problem. And you gave them the second problem.
Yeah. And let's not forget how this is usually going to be framed, both in extremely traditionalistic gynocentric civilizations and in our oh so modern feminist civilizations. Oh, they got addicted to opiates? How base and toxic of them! How animalistic must they be to have gotten addicted to those things? And all just to soothe their tribal aggression that they got from warfare. They must be toxically masculine. Derp.
Yeah, I have family members who served in the military, and like I've seen the way that the VA treats soldiers. I mean, there's a lot of people there who are honestly trying their best, but they don't nearly have the resources that they need to deal with these problems.
No, because those resources either don't exist or aren't being provided. Even
They're mostly
though,
funneled
it,
elsewhere.
for all intents and purposes, it would be very easy to provide them.
Yeah. Now, there's another thing that I want to talk about. It's the epidemic
Hmm. And
that began in the early
I fully
1980s.
expect us to revisit this come the Duality of Man and Drugs show at some point.
Yeah. So I don't know if this has been confirmed, but there are heavy implications that the CIA was involved in the Nicaragua Contras cocaine trafficking operation, which basically flooded crack cocaine, which is cheaper and easier to produce, into American neighborhoods. I believe it was mostly minority neighborhoods as well. But yeah, so
Largely
this
because they were poor, and apparently the aristocracy hates the plebs as per usual.
yeah,
Second verse, same as the first. History kind of
so
rhymes sometimes.
this is absolutely disgusting. The you know an arm of the U.S. intelligence network was essentially poisoning its own citizens in order to fund like foreign conflicts. It's like these are the people that you are supposed to be protecting, and you're willing to just destroy their lives. Like, if this is a conflict that you need to be involved in, which I don't believe that it was at all, like
No.
there are other ways to do it. You don't sacrifice your citizens to get involved with a conflict that you lie to yourself and try to justify by we're doing this for the citizens.
Yeah, and then when this completely comes back and bite you in the ass, you start the drug war, and instead of actually doing anything about the people that you fucked over, or the way you fucked them over, or even the thing you used to fuck them over, you're just going to morally shame them for indulging in the thing that you forced them to indulge in by circumstance.
Yeah,
And and speaking as someone who grew up in the Bush era of war on terror, where we were expected to vilify anything that had to do with anything Middle Eastern and so on and so forth. Um, this is sounding very familiar to exactly what the U.S. government did with regards to movements like Al Qaeda that eventually spawned movements like ISIS, and then proceeded to start an endless war over it because they couldn't have seen that coming, even though it was very obvious that it would happen.
I mean, let's not forget that this didn't just affect um the drug addicts. I mean, yes, they were the primary victims of it, but when they were sent to jail, that destroyed a lot of families as well. So it creates generational problems too.
Yeah, and also the issue of prisons are basically criminal colleges where it'll take someone who's a nonviolent drug offender and turn them into a hardened criminal just for purposes of survival and or dealing with the trauma inflicted on them psychologically by being locked in the same box as your, unstable rapists, your murderers, etc.
Speaking of criminal colleges, in the '94 crime bill, which put a lot of pressure to crack down on drugs, there was actually a provision in it where criminals were no longer eligible for Pell Grants um, while they were in prison. So, like, say somebody wanted to do better, wanted to change their life around, while they were taking this time in jail, which is supposed to reform you. Well, you can't better yourself. You can't get an education and use this time to improve yourself and become a productive member of society. No, you just have to be punished.
Yep. And me- speaking of people's attempts to improve themselves using government systems that inevitably backfire. Funny thing about the alleged overrepresentation of men in college, it was a result largely of a post World War II GI Bill that gave returning veterans money to start businesses, buy homes, or go back to school to learn a new trade or a new skill. And that was when um, men became overrepresented in colleges, not because of some far flung conspiratorial patriarchy, but because men were the ones largely fighting in wars, both because, masculine gender role obligations, but also because of the draft. And then a bunch of feminists in the second wave proceeded to bitch and whine and moan and complain that men were overrepresented, even though just the generation before that, the representation of men and women in colleges was fairly even. But they were both upper class men and women because for most of human history, up until the GI Bill, colleges were something limited to the upper classes.
Yeah. I want to go a bit more into this crime bill because also, let's see, I believe. Where is it? Where is it? Oh yeah, also included in this bill was the Violence Against Women Act.
Oh, lordy. Um, we're not going to be able to tell you anything you probably don't already know if you're watching this show because better content producers than us, particularly Hannah Wallen, has an excellent video on this over on the Honey Badger Radio channel. But before the Violence Against Women Act, there was already a domestic violence bill that was actually gender blind, or at least much less gender slanted. It was called the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. So when you hear women say they want, or feminist women rather, or just feminists, and sorry, I'm being distracted by my cat. I'm gonna have to go and deal with that before she yells
Yeah.
again because I can't fucking focus on this while I'm doing that.
Okay. So the Violence Against Women Act allocated 1.6 billion to help prevent and investigate violence against women. It was renewed in 2000, 2005, and 2013. Increased federal penalties for repeated sex offenders and required mandatory restitution for the medical and legal cost of sex crimes. Safe Homes for Women Act increased federal grants for battered women's shelters, created a national domestic violence hotline, and required for restraining orders of one state to be enforced by other states. And that's the thing. Like, having a battered women's shelter is fine, but there is literally no, battered men's shelter. And usually, if they try to create one, they get protested, which is just
And
absolutely. And there's
yeah,
sure as hell not getting federal funding.
while we're talking about men and governments, we should perhaps take a detour slightly to the tale of one Earl Silverman, who tried for many years to sustain a men's shelter out of his own pocket. And every time he would apply to the Canadian government, because he was Canadian, to get similar or at least some federal funding for a men's shelter as you would from a women's shelter, he would go to his local provincial government and he would say, I need X money to sustain a men's shelter. And status of women, or rather, the provincial government would say, domestic violence is considered a women's issue and we can't allocate funds without the say-so of Status of Women Canada. And so he would write to Status of Women Canada, and
is that a government organization?
Yes, it's basically the equivalent to something like the UK's Equality Commission, or something similar to a woman's rights panel in the American government. But anyway, so he goes to Status of Women Canada as he was requested to by the provincial government. And Status of Women Canada says, we have no mandate to help men. You'll have to go back to the province and say, we need their say-so to give you this, because there's simply nothing on the books that correlates to men as victims of domestic violence, so we don't know how to go about doing this. And so he would write back to the province and say, Status of Women Canada requested that I return to you to get dispensation for this, this, and this, because they don't have anything on the books relating to how one defends male victims of domestic violence. And around and around he would go for, I think, at least like a decade and a half. And eventually he had a nervous breakdown, decided to go through an incredibly risky legal maneuver whereby he threatened someone in the Canadian government to get attention for this, knowing that it would all be revealed on the books. And the province and the court system decided to settle out of court so that it didn't come out on the books. And then he killed himself. all because he was caught between a bureaucratic rock and a bureaucratic hard place, courtesy of the fact that, due to, gynocentric leanings of human psychology, we just don't even have the capacity to notice that blind spot wherein we don't give a fuck about men on a governmental or bureaucratic scale.
Yeah, I feel really bad for that guy. It's a terrible story. I mean, he was just trying to do the right thing, and like the
He just
entire
wanted
system.
one male domestic violence shelter. One. And he couldn't do it out of his own pockets. So he goes to the people whose job it is to normally handle such things, and they give him the bureaucratic runaround so badly that he has a nervous breakdown, sues their asses, fails to sue their asses, and then kills himself.
Do you want to move to MK Ultra?
Sure.
Project MK Ultra was illegal human experimentation undertaken by the CIA. Damn, the CIA does a lot of really messed up shit.
Yeah, a lot of the various investigative bodies do, because most of them had a expiration date when they were originally founded, because a lot of them, in particular the FBI, was founded to help curtail the mob back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then, wouldn't you know it, after the mob became basically a non-issue, they just stuck around, because why not?
There's a saying: nothing is more permanent than a temporary government solution.
Yeah. It,
But
it it puts you in mind of that one scene from Star Wars: Attack of the Clones, where they vote emergency powers to the Chancellor, and he swears, "No, I'll give them back as soon as the current threat has abated." And then, wouldn't you know it, a couple years later, he's an emperor. Is it
the most
funny how
accurate
that works?
that is the most accurate fictional depiction of government I have ever seen.
It's like my inner Padme Amidala. So this is how liberty dies, by thunderous applause.
Yeah, so the MK Ultra experiments were, they were using drugs, mind altering drugs like LSD to be used in like interrogations to try, weaken people, resolve, make them more, pliable. They also did like some brainwashing experiments and psychological torture.
Yeah, and by the way, this is not a psychedelics brand. It's a You can use psychedelics of your own free will all you like, as far as I'm concerned. But when they're actively used upon you for the purposes of breaking your brain rather than bettering it, um, bad.
They also did things like electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse. I did not know about that last one.
Somehow I am not surprised, because people don't really value um, male sex, like, boundaries. Because, again, calling back to what we were talking about last week, if bodily autonomy is such a sacrosanct right for all humans, so much so that we can't even deny women the ability to kill fetuses, um, you might want to equalize that at least a little bit with things men can do, because they can't accuse people of sexual assault and be believed or taken seriously without exceedingly strenuous standards. They can't actively refuse sex without being seen as being gay culturally, or by being seen as difficult on a legal standpoint. They can't avoid getting genitally mutilated when they're children, vis-a-vis circumcision. They can't have any say when their significant other decides unilaterally to abort a child that is at least 50% their DNA. Like, the list goes on and on and on. If these are truly universal human rights, then far be it for me to say that maybe they should apply something resembling universally, or something.
Yeah, so apparently this is a international incident, and that they also ran these experiments on Canadians.
Yep. And funny story about MK Ultra, and similar programs to MK Ultra. I don't know to what extent this bears out in the paperwork, but there is a theory that seems to be backed up by quite a lot of evidence, as far as I can see, that Ted Kaczynski, he who would one day become known as the Unabomber, um, was a fairly normal, albeit sort of um, socially awkward and atypical, semi-autistic type person until he volunteered for a psychological experiment in college that had ties to the FBI and programs like MK Ultra. And one wonders, because he said that much of his resolve to do the things he did later on came from being psychologically abused by this guy who was basically gaslighting him in the formal, actual, proper brainwashing sense that that word is supposed to be used in, and him deciding, no, I will not yield to you. In fact, I will radicalize myself so that I can resist you even more. And then, of course, the Unabomber went on to Unabomb, and yet the government and the FBI whistle, whistle, nothing to see here. This had nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, apparently they ran this like as a like a volunteer program for like universities. You know how universities will have like, you know, experiments like
Volunteers for
trials.
studies, psychological experiments, and that sort. Yeah.
Yeah, so they ran this under that. They also experimented on, I believe, a mental patient in Kentucky for 174 days.
Oh dear. That I was not aware of that. That's kind of sickening. Reminds me of the end
Yeah,
of 1984 a little bit, if I'm honest with you.
yeah. Apparently, they were doing this without the subject's knowledge or informed consent.
Uh-huh. And once again, I must point out this is kind of one of our recurring bits, but modern psychology is fucked beyond all reason, but it's not a new phenomenon. Um, if you look into the history of psychological experiments in particular, there is some quite like SCP Foundation levels of fucked up shit going on there.
Yeah, dude, this gets worse and worse the more I'm reading about it. They set up several brothels in San Francisco in order to obtain men who would be too embarrassed to talk about the events. So they basically, yeah, you don't want people to know you were in a brothel, right? So they wouldn't talk about what happened. And so they went into these brothels and they were dosed with LSD, and they had like one-way mirrors in them so they could see the effects of LSD on these men who were going into this brothel.
Uh-huh. And again, I don't really have a problem with LSD or other psychoactive drugs. My stance is they should be legalized and regulated just like every other fucking kind of drug. But point being, if it's not consensual, if it's not something you choose to do to yourself and it's inflicted upon you from without for the specific purpose of being a psychological crippler or a psychological debilitation, um, that is textbook fucking evil. I don't like using the word evil, but it has to mean something. And it sort of has to mean deliberate mad science experiments on people without their consent, informed or otherwise.
I mean, geez, like these are supposed to be our guys who are doing this to us. Like, everybody involved with these experiments should have been put on death row. They used heroin. They bribed heroin addicts into taking LSD with offers of more heroin.
I but do, you know, it strikes me that you probably could have just been honest with them and saved yourself like all the trouble. Like you could have just offered them LSD because I don't suspect that heroin addicts are going to be all that choosy, and a lot of them, a lot of the people who are into drug culture are fairly open to experimenting. So you literally could have just gotten a bunch of psychonaut hippies in there and done things to them, and it at least would have been more arguable that you're not being inarguably humanitarianly evil.
Yo, So apparently they realized that since its effects were temporary, they believed it could be given to high-ranking officials, and in this way affect the course of important meetings and speeches. So it's basically like you drug like an enemy commander, and he like fucks up the whole war.
Again,
So
I'm getting flashes of the usually rather unbelievable endpoint of 1984. The this is not good. The center cannot hold here. What the
yeah, but
hell?
here's the thing: like they decided to run these experiments outside of a laboratory in normal conditions, where basically he initiated a series of experiments where LSD was given to people in normal settings without warning. So he was just randomly drugging people.
And again, if you want to do that to yourself for your own reasons, that's one thing, but it should not be inflicted. Like drugs in general, I'm not even a fan of secondhand smoke. I hate, people who just smoke indoors for no fucking reason. It's one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. But like, your drug of choice is your drug of choice. The drug of choice bit is the important bit there. And certainly, you should not be using them for some kind of weird governmentally utilitarian, we want to brainwash the plebs into being more subservient fucking rigmarole.
Like this shit was really dangerous. Adverse reactions often occurred, such as an operative who received the drug LSD in his morning coffee became psychotic and ran across Washington, seeing a monster in every car passing him.
You you don't say. Like, okay, so getting off into the like philosophical and metaphysical weeds here just a minute. I believe that LSD and other psychoactive substances can result in something that we in the like metaphysical field refer to as second sight. I do believe that. They've done experiments where they've sent experienced shamans into mental hospitals and they've literally been able to identify someone else's schizophrenic delusions without realizing who that person is, just by virtue of being experienced shamans. So I believe there's something genuinely metaphysical going on with psychedelics. But the thing of it is, the veil, from a like mystical perspective, the limits on human perception are there for a reason and are supposed to be navigated in a very deliberate, very restricted way. I.e., while I believe there's something true inherent in psychedelics for the most part, if you inflict second sight on someone who has no experience or even desire to understand what's going on around them, you are as good as condemning them to insanity by way of not by way of at the very least overstimulation. Because the human brain is limited for a very good reason. Because if we could see literally everything around us, our brains would boggle in the space of about 5 seconds.
I mean, not just the psychological effects, but the physical effects. You don't want to be screwed around with a person's brain chemistry and they have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, because they have done studies in very controlled situations that have shown that psychedelics can actually repair brain damage or increase neuroconnectivity. And if you do it correctly, it can result in um, positive and permanent mood changes. It can result in greater degrees of introspection. Basically it's a fast track to the what the more spiritual among us would call enlightenment. But even experienced shamans will tell you that if you do this in a non formal, non restricted way under very specific circumstances, you will open the doors to delusion and illusion and eventually insanity. And wouldn't you go ahead and know it when our fucking Nuremberg should be on Nuremberg trials, mad scientist folks in the government tried that in a non-restricted, non-informed sense, people started seeing demons and then tried to kill themselves. Because again, if you show all the world to someone who only knows the mundane world without their knowledge, like if they're just having a normal day and then all of a sudden they start seeing demons or or spirits of any kind that they might just falsely interpret as demons, especially if they're like very traditionally religious or something, yeah, you're gonna get people who go insane, end up suicidal, end up hurting themselves and other people, and just generally destroy themselves by virtue of not, it's sort of like trying to fit an entire supercomputer's worth of data into a flash drive. It, you can try it, but it's probably going to damage both at the end of the day.
Yeah, there is one more experiment I want to talk about. Um, it says a guy was injected intravenous administration of barbiturate in one arm, which is a downer, and amphetamine into the other. The barbiturates were released into the person first, and as soon as the person began to fall asleep, the amphetamines were released. Like you could give somebody a freaking heart attack like that.
I okay. Again, I don't know why I keep getting fucking personal with these, but I'm gonna have to cite something from my real life again. Because I I've mentioned before, I have spastic diaplegic cerebral palsy, and to treat it for the longest time, I had what was called an intrathecal baclofen pump. I've since gotten it taken out, but I also happen to have, possibly related, possibly not, rather crippling levels of anxiety that has resulted in quite an irregular heart rate and or heart condition. So much so that after my anxiety resulted in me getting temporarily suspended from college, my heart rate was something along the lines of like one 190 over 90 or 180 over 80. I can't remember which. But what the doctor said when we finally went to the doctor and got this checked out was I should have been either lightheaded, which fortunately I wasn't, or passed out because my heart rate was like one standard deviation away from exploding like a freaking water balloon. And that's just a naturally occurring thing as far as we can tell, or might be related to the baclofen, which I now take orally in case anyone's curious. Um, but either way, if this happened to someone like me, I would just be dead. I would just die because my heart would literally explode. So even if this these people were in absolutely perfect, like Olympian or astronaut level health, this is incredibly misanthropically stupid. But on the off chance you got someone with an underlying heart condition or underlying anxieties, you're just a murderer at that point. And and we all know, and maybe this is how we know, which, I'm all for knowledge being hard won and everything, but good goddamn. Um, Maybe this is how we know you're never supposed to mix drugs because they not only will both of their effects commingle and probably be unstable, but they've also done studies that suggest that taking multiple kinds of drugs at once will actually amplify the effects of both. So even if you take a reasonable dosage of a given drug for yourself and another reasonable dosage of a drug for yourself, the effects will be something like 2 to 3 times stronger in both cases because they're coexisting than it otherwise would be. So you can OD on your regular dosage just by mixing and matching.
Yeah. Now, that kind of reminds me what I took a class once, and they said that it's very dangerous to mix, like, say, alcohol and Red Bull because alcohol, I believe, is a depressant, and Red Bull, being an energy drink, is a
Caffeine very
stimulus.
much a stimulant, so yeah.
So yeah, it's very dangerous to mix those things, two things together, because like you'll still be drunk, and you'll like have all the effects of drunkenness, but it will like stimulate your body, but like you won't be in control. You'll just be awake for it.
Yep. And again, going back to something I've experienced personally, because of complications with the aforementioned baclofen pump, I've also gone through drug withdrawals because one of the time actually this happened twice. Um, the catheter that sends the drug to my spine kinked, and so I started going through with drug withdrawals, which included a fuck ton of muscle spasms because baclofen is a muscle relaxer and technically also an opioid. The first time the withdrawals happened, I also hallucinated for like 3 days. Fortunately, I had some oral baclofen on hand, so it wasn't an entire withdrawal, but um, it in both cases included ridiculous levels of muscle spasms. So I can tell you from experience that just muscle spasms alone can sometimes be annoying because one of the ways I was able to tell I was going through withdrawals the last time I went through them was I was trying to lay down in my bed to go to sleep, as you do, and I was trying to just straighten out my legs, as you do when you're laying down in bed. And they spasmed so badly that every time I straightened out my legs, my tendons would coil up like a rubber band that had been stretched too far, and I would end up sitting up straight in bed just by virtue of my legs not wanting to straighten the fuck out. Horrifying, frankly.
I mean, I haven't had anything that bad, but I used to get frequent leg cramps when I was sleeping, and it
Oh,
was
wow.
just like really, really painful.
Yeah, huh?
Like I was screaming. It hurt so bad.
Yep. Yep, yep, yep. I once had to get my legs put in a cast for um they were planning on designing new braces for me, which required me to be in a cast. And then for like the second set of castings, the doctor just wanted me to take half of the previous cast and tie it to my legs while I was sleeping. And the sharp edges of the um, partially sawn off cast that was being tied on with like surgical gauze um, were cutting into my legs as I was trying to sleep. And I couldn't fucking move because my legs were tied up in casts. So sucked to me. Although fortunately, after like the second night this happened, we just decided to stop using them entirely. It, and sucks to be that doctor, but I wasn't going to shove sharp things that were tied with gauze onto my legs every night just for straightening out my bone growth or whatever the fuck.
Did everything work out?
I mean it most things generally do. I've been very lucky because my um cerebral palsy is spastic diaplegic and not quadriplegic, so I can still function pretty well as long as I'm on the right medications, which I seem to be on an okay dosage of oral baclofen now. Um, so that worked out fine, but let it never be said that I don't know what suffering is all I'm saying, I guess.
Now, the worst thing about the MK Ultra experiments, in my opinion, is that they were done without the subject's knowledge, like giving dangerous mind altering drugs to people, and then they just like go about their everyday life until it hits them. Like somebody could be behind the wheel of a vehicle, and then all of a sudden they're on an LSD trip.
Yeah. And again, it's like even if you're like me and you believe there's some kind of truth to psychedelic experience, even assuming that they weren't even assuming that they weren't filtering what they were seeing incorrectly or they weren't filtering it through their own personal experience in a way that was unhealthy, which we can't know because they weren't in a formal shamanic or formal medical setting. Seeing spiritual or metaphysical things when you're only used to, you know, right in front of you physical mundane reality while you're in the middle of doing physical mundane reality things, I'm pretty sure that would drive anyone nuts. Even assuming that none of those spiritual entities or the hallucination caused by misinterpreting them were trying to hurt you in any way, even assuming it was just like a, you know, land spirit or something trying to see what was up with you. Um, if you're not prepared to be seeing those sorts of things, or you don't even know that you're potentially going to be seeing those sorts of things, you're going to freak the fuck out because you're seeing something so foreign to your mundane experience that you just don't know how to process it.
Yeah.
This is why when you go adventuring in the psychedelic sense, either for practical spiritual purposes or just for your own leisure, you need to be informed, relaxed, and in as stable a mindset as you can be, because otherwise it's going to wind up being a bad trip regardless. And having a bad trip, especially without expecting a trip, period, yeah, that's not gonna go well at all.
Could you just imagine somebody like going into work hating their boss? Like, my boss is such a jackass, and then goes to the shop for a cup of coffee, and it's a CIA front, and he's like getting dosed with LSD, goes into work and starts tripping.
Yeah, and then said boss literally sprouts a donkey's head and starts hee hawing in their face, at least according to their perceptions.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of thing that psychedelics do. They often, especially if you're not trained in how to use them correctly in like a shamanic or medical sense, will just amplify anything that's latently in there anyway. So if you think to yourself, my boss is such a jackass, then you're gonna wind up with fucking um the the Egyptian donkey demon Ea just randomly taking the place of your boss or something. Who knows?
You know, you mentioned about spiritual things, and you know the well, I'm Christian, and you know what the traditional greetings for angels is to people.
Be not afraid.
Yeah. Well, I read online there was an alternate translation. Please stop screaming. I'm not here to hurt you.
Yeah, and we've gotten so far afield into the weeds on the psychedelia thing, but this is one of my areas. I've been a practicing occultist for 16 years, so I kind of have some experience with these sorts of things. In the classical depictions of angels in like the classical biblical sense, angels of the Old Testament are fucking Lovecraftian. Like Lovecraft did not invent the prospect of spirituality being scary. Go back and look at um, apocryphal um, mystical texts of the Jewish Torah or the Christian Bible someday, and and listen to descriptions of angels, or go looking into grimoires for demons of the Ars Gotia, and you'll see that Lovecraft didn't make up a damn thing. He just kind of brought back what the Victorians had suppressed, because the Victorians like to prettyify every aspect of spirituality from angels to fairies.
All right, let's get back more on topic because we could
Yeah,
literally go
it's
off on
yeah.
this all day.
Men and spirituality, or men and magic, would be a very interesting. And I definitely want to do a men and witchcraft episode for October, because I really hate the prospect of witch trials being treated like a women's issue by modern scholars, because it just isn't so. But that's possibly for October. Put a pin in that for several months, I guess, folks.
Yeah, let's go to the Tuskegee experiment.
Oh dear.
Are you
Again,
familiar?
the the kinds of things that early psychologists did to people are exactly the sorts of things that we put Nazi scientists on trial in Nuremberg for.
Yeah. So it was actually run by the United States Public Health Service and the Center for Disease Control. It was on a group of nearly 400 African Americans with syphilis. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated, though by the end of the study, medical advancement meant that it was entirely treatable. The men were not informed of the nature of the experiment, and more than 100 died as a result. So basically, they says, "Hey, would you like to get a checkup or something?" And then, they didn't know that they had syphilis, but the doctors knew, and the doctors just observed them as they died. They didn't try to help them or anything. They just watched the how the disease killed people and says, now maybe we can figure out how to make a treatment for this since we know how it killed all these men.
I I sort of I sort of feel like you may want to have at least had some experimental cures before the 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 marching men to their deaths. But what the fuck do I? And again, we wind up in this place of like one of the most horrifying aspects of this is the uninformed part. Because if you had just informed the people in question, maybe even some of them would have volunteered. But the idea of just going about your average, everyday, mom baseball, apple pie, suburban lifestyle, and by the way, you're dying of a horrible disease and no one is willing to do anything about it. And the people who you would go to figure out something about it, they knew all along and they've just been fucking with you for for reasons.
Because they did not even try. I mean, hell, if you tried, at least if you failed, you were at least attempting to save the
Yeah,
person's life.
at the very least, it could have been in for a few to be immortal, many must die. But you weren't even trying to do the for a few to be immortal, many must die thing. It's just, this person's dying anyway, and we need data on this, so let's just watch them die with like popcorn, and then after they're dead, we can autopsy them, and then maybe figure out what went wrong. Um, no, just no. All of the annals of history are now contained in the word no.
Want to know the most messed up thing? It
Oh
says,
dear.
well, one, they specifically targeted poor black people, and two, as an incentive for participation in the study, the men were promised free medical care. Jesus, like the biggest. That's got to be one of the biggest lies of the century.
And to call back to modern, to the modern world again, folks, this is why it is perfectly justifiable to be skeptical when people say they're doing things in the name of the science. First of all, there is no such entity as the science. At best, you could say the science is, but even better, you could say the natural sciences. But even then, it's partially method, partially, a scientific method, but also partially a philosophical framework, namely a mixture of empiricism, naturalism, observationalism, and materialism. So, like, don't let anyone police you in the name of the authority of the abstract entity known as the science, because it's literally just a secular version of the church or the people, in a classical religious or Marxist context or
Yeah,
secular.
yeah. We just read about all these experiments. How many lives were sacrificed for the science?
How many like Mayan priests of the science unwittingly tore hearts out without even realizing that was what they were doing?
Yeah, it says. Let's see. It was supposed to run for 6 months, but it ended up for 40 years. After funding for treatment was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they would never be treated. None of the men were treated with penicillin, despite the fact that by 1947, penicillin was readily available.
40 years. Um, You know, I know I just likened the science to the church, and I was stretching, I think, a little bit for the sake of rhetorical effect when I said that, but that's about the same amount of time that things like the Burning Times and the Inquisition were in full swing. And I once again want to ask you the question: if if giving giving men no treatment for syphilis in the name of the science was swapped out for burning people at the stake in the name of the church, would this in any way be seen as, or worse yet, it if the Tuskegee prison experiment was done by one of the Nazi doctors in Auschwitz, would it seem out of place at all? Because I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I would believe that this existed, but I would believe this existed more. I would have a much easier and more like orderly time believing this if this was the Dr. Mengele from Auschwitz style of experimentation going on. But no, this was done by the American government in our own green and pleasant land in a time that was supposed to be some sort of traditionalistic leave it to beaver paradise. Do you not
Yeah.
see why I'm skeptical of tradition yet?
Yeah. It was apparently this experiment was continued under numerous public health service supervisors until 1972. So there are people who started the experiment, left, new people came in, found out about it, and said, "Yeah, this is fine."
Yeah, not only this is fine, but man, I gotta get me on the ground floor of this scientific breakthrough. And again, beware the nouveau riche priests of the science, ladies and gentlemen. It is not just a modern phenomena either. The more
Yes.
things change, the more they vary. Very, very evidently stay the same.
So
At
by the
least as
time the
far as we can be persuaded to not give a fuck about men. Which brings up once again the question of men's rights movement question mark.
So here's the thing: by the time the experiment was shut down, 28 patients had died directly from syphilis. 100 died from complications related to syphilis. 40 of the patients' wives were infected with syphilis, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis.
Uh-huh. So unironically, our apathy for what we do to men was so bad that it actually did end up spilling over into women and children. And only then did it seem like a bad thing. I really, and again, this is a men's rights show, so I get to say this, but I really feel like this could have been resolved by people just like acknowledging the basic humanity of male humans. Like nine times out of 10, all of these could have been resolved by people being reminded, oh hey, men are human. Maybe we shouldn't inflict horrible travesties onto them.
It gets worse.
Oh dear.
Let's see. In addition, scientists prevented participants from accessing syphilis treatment programs available to other residents in the area. Not only did they not treat them, they prevented them from getting treatment.
They just actively were like, nope, nope, we can't let you get treated because if we let you get treated, then that will fuck up our experiment. But wasn't the purpose of the experiment to get a better treatment for syphilis? And don't we already have that? Yeah, but you see, the glory of our emotionally detached curiosity compels us. So, eh, you're only a male human. It's not like we're getting rid of one of the valuable people like women and children. But what about all those women and children you inadvertently affected by your callous lack of empathy for men? Collateral damage? Question mark. Wait, maybe we
Oh,
are the baddies. Maybe we fucked something up. So it literally took you until you affected women and children to figure out that you may have been the baddies.
all
Yeah,
right.
I
So
mean,
apparently, the
what were we
study.
supposed to care about men before we affected women and children?
Okay,
Uh,
so apparently the study was not secret since reports and data sets were published to the medical community throughout its duration. So the medical community knew, but the wider public did not.
So the not only did some new people after the original set of people left come in and go, I gotta get me a piece of this action, but the medical community at large were just like, we are waiting with bated breath to figure out how this ends. It ends with you being the baddies, is how it ends. It ends with this being literally a historical example of how not to do the science. God damn it.
So apparently, 256 of the subjects registered for the draft during World War II, and they were required to get treatment before they could do their military service. But like the people who were running the experiments stopped them from getting treatment, and then I think it went to the War Department and said, "Yeah, not these guys. Take these other guys over here. We need these guys."
Uh, d- Put, put. So the only okay. The only possible out these poor men had was we can't be sacrificed to the science machine because we're too busy being sacrificed to the war machine. And the response was, you can't have these war machine, not because we actually care about these men in any meaningful way, but because we're too busy already exploiting them in a different way that requires us to have no empathy whatsoever for men.
Because
And people ask me why I am a men's rights advocate, ladies and gentlemen.
the thing is, by 1947, they discovered that they could use penicillin to treat syphilis, but it continued until 1972.
So again, you already have the answer. You you didn't even necessarily need to go through these lengths to get your answer. And even though you have the answer, you're not going to avail these men you tortured of this answer because you're just too curious to see what will happen. Uh-huh. I'm getting mental flashes of those priests that end up diddling children and making the entire clergy look bad for everyone else. Well, what do you suppose that this does for the priests of the science, ladies and gentlemen, particularly gentlemen? Because for once I'm going to actually do it.
You know, as much as I love this country, it's very difficult sometimes because there is no ethical justification for a lot of the things that occur.
Although, to be fair, this is not something unique to the American government. This is
True.
something that has happened for millennia throughout history, and nobody bats an eye unless it affects my women and children. I, I mean, lest we forget, and I definitely wanted to bring this up before we get done with the men in government episode. In some areas in Europe and Canada, I don't know if it ever happened in the US, but I know in certain places in Europe and in Canada, there was what's known as a bachelor tax. Because the logic was if you are a man who is independent and living only your own life and not supporting women and children, you are manning wrong and therefore need to be punished because we are too busy providing for said women and children. I mean, not to go back to the old men's rights cliche, but on the Titanic, what did they say? Men and yeah, women and children first, which leaves who left if there needs to be anyone left? That would be men. And what does a man say to a highwayman in the hopes that he will survive the mugging? Don't shoot, I have a wife and children. Meaning that, at least in the abstract sense, a man's life is only his utilitarian functions, and in particular his usefulness to wife and children, or woman and children. Which does rather paint a sort of dehumanizing picture, does it not, of all other aspects of what it is to be a man.
Government. I've heard that I forget who said this, but for a government uh between nations, the currency is the lives of men.
Yep, yep,
They will spend however many men they have to in order to accomplish certain goals, especially back in the days where, full blown war was more prevalent. Like, we want this territory and we will spend as many lives as we need to get it.
yeah. And also, I'm mildly disturbed by the idea that one of the ways that they've prevented us from ever addressing the men's rights issues of history is by basically sectioning off certain men from other men, i.e., in the civil rights movement, it was considered to be the blackness of the people in the civil rights movement that made them worthy of civil rights. In the gay rights movement, it was considered to be their homosexuality and eventually their femininity in particular, because that's the other thing about gay rights in relation to both government and society is for the longest time one of the justifications for um abusing or being indifferent to the travesties of the befell gay men was, what do you want? They don't love women. They they've already thrown in their man card by virtue of not loving women. It wasn't until the feminist movement and other similar movements came along and went, hey, gay men are particularly effeminate. That makes them like women. Therefore, we should extend humanity to them. That the gay rights movement really took off in, air quotes, polite society, which to me is a little bit disturbing because this is exactly how the feminist ideology works. You don't get any rights insofar as you embrace your manhood or your masculinity, but if we can somehow airsats connect you to femininity or womanhood, then we care about you, and then you can be included in rights movements. Like, black men used to be discriminated against largely because they were considered hyper masculine and therefore animalistic and therefore not able to control themselves, which is why lynching was more about anti-rape hysteria than it was about race. The original logic of lynching wasn't "Grr, he's a black man, let's lynch him." It was "Grr, he's a black man, therefore he's more masculine, therefore he's more animalistic, and therefore he's likely to rape our pure virginal white women, and therefore let's lynch him." Um, but
I
but
wasn't
as
aware about the whole gay thing, but now that you mention it, when we a lot of depictions of gay people in social in media today are really a lot of the most effeminate men that you will ever find.
yeah, it's the most flamboyant feminine bottom you can find, and all the masculine bottoms and tops who are masculine, and people who are just indifferent or worse than masculine, well, they're not gaying correctly, so they don't speak for the gay hive mind, I guess. And with black men, it was very much the same thing. As long as the rationale of black men are more masculine and therefore we can discriminate against them more existed, then the travesties continued. The very second though someone went, hey, black men are oppressed, kind of like women are, then it was acceptable to give them civil rights and shit. And that's exactly how the modern day feminist intersectional framework works. You're valued
I think
based
that
on how
doesn't work
closely you
because
mirror womanhood,
it's a good
basically,
thing
or
that,
how much we
like,
think you do.
it doesn't work because a lot of the groups that they are trying to intersect are actively at conflict with one another.
And or their understanding of these groups in the abstract, like their ideological construct of blackness and gayness, are either completely foreign to actual people in these groups or actively counter to these groups.
You know, I we talked a lot about how you know the government is failing the citizens, and to be fair, it's failed them quite a lot over the years. But I think that we as men, citizens who comprise this country, we also have a responsibility to hold leaders accountable, make sure that they do what is best for the citizens, for the people of the country, and when they don't, to get rid of them and elect new people to represent us. But we don't. We get stuck in like this lazy tribal nonsense where we'll vote for anybody with a D or R next to their name, and it doesn't matter how terrible they are. They just stay in office and power because it's easier than actually paying attention to the issues and actually trying to be aware of what's going on in this country and make sure that it's going into a right direction, other than just saying, hey, if you give us free stuff, we'll vote for you, or if you pander to us on these purely first world problem issues that only affect like 2% of the country, we'll listen. And they don't actually solve problems, because once they solve problems, well, then what are we going to count?
What good are you that?
People are
What good are
professional
you
users.
now? But another aspect of this is the way that they often dodge this obvious truth of being serving the lowest common denominator is by playing some version or other of the woman card. For example, before or very soon after the suffragette movement had done its work and universal female suffrage was a thing, the temperance movement came about, largely being foisted upon us by middle class or upper middle class suburban church wives, um, and they got prohibition passed,
Yeah, nothing.
allegedly without the suffrage that was so very necessary. When
No,
when Joe Biden passed the Violence Against Women Act in place of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act in 1994, he was a man, but he was serving the siren song of the gynocentric for the women charge.
yeah, they the church wives got the prohibition passed. Nothing bad ever came out of that. The mob.
Yeah, just the mob became several orders of magnitude more powerful for several decades. Um, Violence actually went up because people couldn't find any meaningful catharsis.
Not only
Um,
that, but bootlegging became such a profitable business that if you interfered with the flow of alcohol, you got gunned down.
yeah, again, mob. Um, speaking of
It
spe-
goes even beyond that, because as you mentioned, because the mob became so prevalent because they were making so much money off prohibition, the FBI was formed, and that's never had any unfortunate consequences.
cough cough Gitmo, 99.9% of the of the victims of our men, by the way, because we still apparently just can arbitrarily turn off our ability to empathize with other men as and when it's convenient. Um, and not to mention, speaking of prohibition, the because people were making alcohol in their homes without medical or industrial quality and purity standards, much in the same way as the modern drug epidemic is a thing. Moonshine was far more impure and had many more risks than other kinds of hooch did.
Is that where the rumor that you'll go blind if you drink moonshine came from?
Yes, and it is actually true if you're not very careful about how you distill your moonshine. Um, which again, much in the same way as modern day people have a very informal, very I'll figure it out as I go approach to manufacturing drugs in their homes, so too many people in that era had a similar approach to distilling. And and I'm not faulting home distilling, by the way. Modern home distilling is much better because of the lessons we learned from this era in particular. But much in the same way as with modern drug culture, there were many impurities in hooch that was produced at home that were not in any other kind of alcohol. And people actually did suffer strokes, suffer long term brain damage, poison themselves to death, both slowly and quickly, depending on how many impurities you were talking about. It was frankly quite stunning, and that's not even throwing in. By the way, you also might get shot down by the mob at an
Not
even
only that,
interval.
but like say you try to set up a distillery and didn't know what you were doing exactly. Like that's essentially chemicals in the home. You could start a
Yeah,
fire
you
and you
could
could blow
literally blow
yourself up.
yourself up because you have to pressurize the booze in the still in order to actually distill it. So if the pressure didn't have a proper relief valve of some description, or if you just weren't in the right place to do distilling, it could blow up. And alcohol fires are a son of a bitch, ladies and gentlemen. They are not to be fucked with. Like
Yeah,
they're not put out easily by just regular water. Um, chemical fires, oil fires, and alcohol fires are some of the worst possible fires you can have in the home.
because isn't it like they can't be put out with water? I don't believe. Like they have to be put out with like special compound. I forget what
Well,
it's called.
no, you can put them out with water, but it takes more of it with alcohol fires than it does with just random.
All right, that's grease fires you can't put out with water.
Yeah, no, they'll flare up. They'll flare up too, but alcohol has a similar thing. Especially if it's a chemically impure uh, alcohol, because frankly, if you're if you're not careful with your distilling in the home, you're basically working with rubbing alcohol, which is pure alcohol, which is not exactly water. Uh, it doesn't exactly mix with pure water well, so you do have to mix it with something in order to emulsify it and prevent the two from
Yeah,
just
it has
not
dangerous
interacting at
fumes
all.
and is extremely flammable.
Uh-huh.
So we talked about needing to fix the government and hold people accountable. Like, do you think it's possible to do that today's day and age? Because a lot of the people in power are very deeply entrenched. They love their power and the wealth that comes from it, and they're not just gonna like let go of it very easily.
Yeah, and fortunately for us, they're also almost all of them very, very old and very, very out of touch and very, very stupid and very, very much because of ideological reasons running counter to human nature. I think that's going to be their downfall, and I don't think it's going to take much because there are populist upswings in both wings of the political spectrum, grassroots populist upswings in both wings of the political spectrum, and the establishment is so dilapidated both by incompetence and by age and by their own their own bureaucracy is essentially strangling them to death as they are aging out to a ludicrous degree, that my money, especially in the coming years, is going to be there's going to be a populist upswing on both sides, and the entire establishment dichotomy is going to be slowly burnt down from the inside out.
What you really need to do is get somebody in there who's going to tear down a lot of this bureaucracy and like government agencies that contribute nothing and do nothing.
Yeah, one minor miracle at a time, though. First, we need to cripple the existing establishment. Then, then we can hopefully after we've crippled the current establishment, there will be an actual dichotomy of parties that is worth voting for. Like I've often said, there's maybe six politicians total, three on either side, that I would consider voting for. On the on the Republican side, it's Trump, DeSantis, and Rand Paul, and on the Democratic side, it's Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and Ro Khanna. So maybe we do just genuinely need to remove all of the existing politicians except for those six, and then those six can actually form a party dichotomy that is based on something that isn't completely and utterly fucked beyond all reason. Maybe.
I once had the comical idea of just drafting Congress like in the military. You have been selected to do your service for the country in by holding office in Congress for the state of blah blah blah. You hold
For
that
this
office for a
duration
total
of
of like,
time, yeah.
yeah, for like 6 years, 6 or 8 years, and after that you're done.
And actually, there are a lot of countries that have an obligatory draft, and I wouldn't mind seeing that switched to an obligatory political draft. Like there were people in ancient Rome and ancient Greece whose job was specifically to be a public servant. So maybe having a draft for essentially civil servants or public servants would certainly be a lot more humane than a war draft, in my opinion.
Yeah, thinking back on the Tuskegee experiments, it reminds me of this saying about government organizations. In order to explain the behavior of any government bureaucracy, just assume it's been taken over by a cabal of its enemies.
Yep. Or in most cases, I think in the modern era, they're operating on an ideology that says that capitalism and or political power itself is bad, and so the only proper use for these things is to use them against themselves. If you just operate on the assumption that every person in a position of power has a vehement hatred for positions of power and feels like the only proper use for that power is to undermine themselves, it all makes a lot more sense.
I mean,
And
maybe the new
the
people,
same is
but the
true of
older people, I
CEOs.
think.
If you assume they're all capitalists who hate capitalism so much that they choose to use capitalism to destroy itself, then everything kind of makes a hell of a lot more sense.
I mean, the thing is, even the anti-capitalists are capitalists. Remember, Representative Ocasio Cortez selling shirts saying like "tax the rich" for like $50.
Yeah, that I see that as cognitive dissonance. I don't even think that's conscious manipulation or even subconscious manipulation. I see that as because their ideology requires them to have a completely backwards understanding of human nature. They consciously and even subconsciously believe one thing while their instincts are screaming at them to do the exact opposite. That's why you can have AOC screaming about how wealth is bad as she stands in the Met Gala that has like 15,000 dollars a ticket and like another 6,000 per table and so on. It's because instinctively, on an evolutionary psychology perspective, she wants the money and the power, but every other fiber of her being is screaming money and power is bad. So you wind up in this vicious program loop of my instincts want X, but my self wants Y. Therefore, it's backwards cognitive dissonance the whole way down.
I really dislike her.
Yeah, and I'm ashamed that I used to support the Justice Democrats when they were first getting started because I actually thought that they would stick to the platform that they were supposed to stick to.
To be fair, even I don't think that they even were aware of the monster that they were going to unleash.
No, no, they weren't, and that's why I don't feel quite as bad about it. But as soon as AOC got in there and completely ass fucked in perpetuity the concept of the Green New Deal by making it more green and less New Deal, I was just like, nope, nope. Because the thing of it was, I am genuinely a Scandinavian style social democrat, policy wise. Principle wise, I'm somewhere in the vicinity of a libertarian or classical liberal, but policy wise, I'm genuinely somewhere in the vicinity of a Scandinavian style social democrat. But there is a fundamental difference between social democracy and democratic socialism. So I saw the Justice Democrat as an attempt to get social democracy of, the Scandinavian style. AOC gets in there and she immediately speeds right past the limitations of social democracy and straight into straight up democratic socialism bordering on communism. And it was at this moment where I was like, oh dear, this 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 is going to be horrible. What have I done?
And like it just seems like whenever one side or the other doesn't get what they want, they just want to completely throw out all the rules. Did you
Yeah,
see they were introducing a bill to introduce four new Supreme Court justices?
yeah. With And honestly, the correct answer to prevent these kind of bullshit things from happening in the future is to limit the power of the Supreme Court like it was originally. Because the Supreme Court is not supposed to have the disproportionate powers that it currently has. It never was. It was
I don't think the
designed.
federal government as a whole is supposed to have this much power.
Okay, yes, that's a fair point too. But in particular, let's do something about the judiciary because the other two at least have each other to keep them in check. The judiciary kind of floats on the top of both of the other two, and this is what happens when that happens.
But what do you think about introducing like new justices? Personally, I think it just screams of we didn't get what we want, so we're changing the rules.
Well, and it's only going to become a exponential farce. They add some new justices, then the next time the other guys add some new justices, then the other guys add some new justices, and on and on and on. And eventually, there's more space in the judicial house than there is in either of the other two buildings of Congress because there are just so many goddamn justices. Like literally every justice will be like drafted into the Supreme Court, and they'll have to schedule meetings so that various justices can come to Washington and do Supreme Court shit. And then the judiciary will become as bureaucratic and inefficient as literally every other part of the government, and then it'll be in an even worse state. In actuality, the correct answer is limit as much as possible the powers of the Supreme Court, and I'm just going to say it. Why are there no term limits on Supreme Court justices? Because a lot of this could be resolved by there being term limits on the Supreme Court justices as well. In
I think
fact,
it's
term limits for everyone, and specifically term limits in terms of the number of terms you can serve, would be nice too.
I think it's supposed to because like they want the Supreme Court to not have to engage in like political campaigning for their job, and also I think with the last appointment it's supposed to be so that they can focus on the law and not just doing things like hurry up before I get out of office. Because like presidents, like when it's their last term, they try to push.
Yeah, they'll hurry up and like, oh, I have to make my mark on the histories, so all the things that I should have been doing the whole time but haven't because reasons.
Yeah, so I think that's why that it's a lifetime appointment.
But yeah, frankly, I would prefer term limits on everyone, and more to the point, limits on the number of terms you can serve, because that is one of the smartest things we ever did to the presidency was limit the number of terms someone can serve.
I think George
Because
Washington actually did that.
yeah, because if you can um just keep being reelected, then the term limits don't really matter, do they? Like if you can just keep being reelected and reelected and reelected over and over. But if you actually have a limited number of terms of like, okay, 4 years here and another 4 years there, and boom, like that seems
Especially
to
in
me like a more sustainable system.
especially in Congress, because some of those people have been there so long and have just they've made the country a lot worse. They've made themselves a lot richer. And the thing is, like, they're in such areas where like it's all for like one party, and the other party rarely has a chance. That
Yeah.
they could just stay in there for like decades and not really do anything for their constituents. But
And also, it leads to the establishment being cripplingly out of touch and cripplingly dilapidated because the people in question become so old and so out of touch and so aristocratic, they literally don't know how to do their jobs or even have the competency to do so. Cough, cough, Biden and Pelosi cough. They're they're both in their fucking 80s. And I understand that our generation has a difficulty transitioning into a meaningful adulthood because we add a bunch of baggage to the term adult that doesn't really need to be there. But as a result, we let the adults in the room, quote unquote, do things for 50 fucking years, and then we're surprised when they act like it's still 50 fucking years ago. because that was the last time they had a fucking clue what was going on with the world or themselves or anything else.
Not only that, but do you really want someone that old and who's like that declined mentally and health wise to be making such important decisions? Like I think Biden is the perfect example of that because my God, the man, like
He
his
had
brain is very clearly not running at full capacity.
he was already as bad as Jimmy Carter, who is one of the worst presidents we ever had, and then nature just went, have all the dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever it happens to be. Have all the cognitive decline and neuro degeneration that you can have at your age.
It's like
And
that
that was
one
useful
meme.
for the establishment because that made him literally a puppet. They're literally weakened at Bernie-ising him, but it's not
It's
so
like
good for like the real world or anything relating to logic.
it's like that one meme with the guy holding the signs. Our expectations were low, but holy shit! Like I didn't like Biden, and I wasn't expecting much from him. But even I wasn't expecting this.
Yeah, no, I like many people on the left wanted Bernie, Tulsi, or Yang, and after Bernie screwed us over a second time, Bernie is officially dead to me. But yeah, I think I can speak for most of the left, even when I say the left didn't want him either. It was literally the aristocracy anointed him and didn't give us any option. It's the same reason why he picked Kamala Harris as VP because she was even lower on the list of voting percentage than he was, but because she's the greatest establishment shill and the least likely to change the status quo, she's VP because we declare it. Doesn't matter if anyone likes her or if she'll do anything meaningful. It's just anyone but the ones the people actually want. Because if we give the people what they actually want, uh, they might feel as though we're obligated to give them what they want. You mean like how literally everything else voluntary in the universe works? It's exactly the attitude that Hollywood has towards fandom, like genuine, sincere fandom. If we give people what they want, that's toxic because then they might actually expect what they want to be the standard instead of us literally using art as a means to an end at every given interval possible.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of
Duality of
violating
men in
human
Hollywood
rights,
when
isn't Kamala Harris the woman who extended prisoners' terms in California so they could basically be used as free labor to fight wildfires?
yes she did. She also was the one who in 2012 laughed at the prospect of legalizing pot in California. You know, I don't think we can say it any better than Tulsi Gabbard did in that second debate. The famous your own record no jitsu that she did. By the power of your own fucking record, you will be doomed. And it's like, well, she was at 15% of the vote. Now she's at 3% of the vote. Good job, Tulsi.
That's like the political equivalent of a power bomb through a table, to use a wrestling reference.
It's just like final flash.
That was probably
Um,
the best part of any debate that year.
yeah, and again, this is why I consider Tulsi Gabbard to be one of the three politicians who, if I had my druthers, would survive the politician purge that I would do if I had absolute power. Like if I had the Infinity Gauntlet, I snapped all of the useless politicians. There would be only 6 politicians left in the country, and it would be Trump, DeSantis, and Rand Paul on the Republican side, and Tulsi Yang and Ro Khanna on the Democratic side, and the rest of, and they would just have to come together and figure something out.
All right, so we've been going for almost an hour 45. Do you think this is a good place to stop?
I think so. This is probably the longest one we've ever done. Which
Yeah,
I mean,
probably.
there was a lot to discuss because there was just a lot to discuss. But um, yeah,
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. Uh, I'm Mystery.
And I am Mortimer the Authenticator, and this has been the Duality of Men. Cheers, guys.